This is a review of the 1972 Martin Ritt film Sounder, starring Cicely Tyson, Paul Winfield, and a young Kevin Hooks. This is a great movie that I have a lot to say about, so let's just get started. First of all, this movie came out in 1972, so you might immediately think about blaxploitation. That's the time and sort of the subject matter for it. But this is not a blaxploitation film, really, for some reasons I'm going to touch on. I don't want to get into blaxploitation really in this review at all, so I would just say, if you're curious about that, go check out my extensive video about The Spook Who Sat by the Door, or my video on Claudine, which is another movie that isn't really a blaxploitation film. I do want to mention one thing about it, which is that blaxploitation films are in some ways, I think, inherently modern, partly because of the setting. They're set usually in sort of inner cities, right? Partly because of the style. They've got interesting style, tons of cuts jumping all over the place. They've got music. They've got a Curtis Mayfield soundtrack or Herbie Hancock, some sort of funk music or something like that, usually. But these are kind of superficial reasons. More deeply, blaxploitation seems to be just innately connected to modernity and its extremities. This macabre look at anxieties, at dilemmas, at the overlooked parts of the world or something that sort of posits, in some ways, a jungle in the inner city or something like that, right? So anyway, point is, these are typically modern films, and this movie is basically completely the opposite of that because it's a historical film. Now, I will say there are some blaxploitation films that are not set in the present time, but I think those are sort of the exception. This is a historical film set in 1933. In 1933, there was no funk music, so there's no funk music in the soundtrack, but beyond the superficial, this is sort of fundamentally a different type of movie. Rather than being a jarring, in-your-face film with huge, vivid, larger-than-life characters and sort of extreme settings and characters and plots, this movie has a very light touch, and I'll talk about that more. Here's a question. Is this movie ahead of its time? I think for some people it obviously is, because this movie gives a real voice and a real story to black characters, which was a thing that didn't happen so much back in the day. Now, on the other hand, there were in fact many movies. Now, the blaxploitation movement is complex, as touched on the other review, but this is in some ways not as rare as you might think. And while, currently we have huge movements, social movements, empowering black voices in the United States, like Black Lives Matter and such, you got to keep in mind that in 1972, we had the Black Power movement. We had the Black Panthers in the United States, right, of which seemingly there is no modern equivalent. So I'm not exactly saying that we should go back to 1972, but there may have been a more strong progressive trend than some people realize when they say, wow, this movie's so ahead of its time, nothing like this was going on back then. Well, not entirely true. At the same time, maybe they just mean, well, this is such a subtle movie. This movie has great acting. This movie has a light touch. It has a delicate story. That's why it's ahead of its time. Well, for that, I would say that actually that's more common in the 1970s than it is now. So if anything, this movie is right at home in the 70s for most of its virtues. On the other hand, this movie does, I think, remind me of some modern independent films. It has vibes like the film First Cow, I would say, just in its kind of subtlety, in some ways, in its kind of light touch. If you hate First Cow, forget what I said about that. But I do understand, some people might say it's ahead of its time. Well, it does have some sort of resonance with some movies, some independent films that are coming out now. But on the other hand, in some ways, it makes sense that it came out in 1972. It's just that maybe not everybody realizes exactly sort of the cinematic and historical context of the time. So like I said, this is a historical film, but it's not a historical epic. This is another reason why I think some people might think that it's ahead of its time. Maybe when they picture historical films of the past, they think about Ben-Hur. They think about Dr. Zhivago. They think about, of course, these movies are not from the 70s, but maybe they think about these big, over-the-top, epic things, right? Movies that put the history in your face, movies with big set pieces, movies that lavish in their ability to recreate the past or something, right? Probably the pinnacle of this maybe is Titanic, right? Where we are using modern computer animation and such to recreate the past, and that's really, the movie is sort of a spectacle, right? The historical spectacle, the epic. Maybe that's what people have in mind when they picture an older historical movie, and this certainly is not that at all. This movie starts out in darkness. There's no big establishing shots. It starts with a father, a son, and their dog going on a hunt. In the darkness, there's no setting at all, really. They mention what year it is, and it's in Louisiana in a little title. But other than that, there's basically no backdrop. The movie just comes out of darkness. In some ways, once the sun comes up, we're on a farm. We're not close to anything. I should mention briefly, by the way, I never really talk about the plot of movies on this channel. Perhaps I should mention it a little bit more. So this movie, the literal content is about a family of sharecroppers in Louisiana during the Depression. That's probably all you need to know. They've got this farm that's basically kind of in the middle of nowhere. The young children, the son has to walk 6 miles to get to school. He's walking there on this dusty gravel road. He gets passed at one point by a car, tries to hitchhike. They don't pick him up. He shows up late to school, walks in the school, and there's a bunch of white kids in the school, walks to the back, sits down there with a couple of the other black children, right? So, very interesting. School is actually a big part of this film. Well, let me back up a little bit and just close this thought on the setting. So, like I said, this is not like a big historical epic. It's a simple historical film where you start with not a lot, but slowly and slyly, that not a lot, that distance, that isolation becomes a big point, a big part of the movie. Obviously, this 6-mile walk is both an interesting historical thing. This movie really gives you a sense of, wow, like no computers, no internet. what would it have been like? You got to walk all over the place. You got to write letters to people. I mean, obviously, like old movies, these are not like amazing insights on my part, but this movie, I think, has a particularly vivid focus on the quotidian, just on seeing people's everyday lives, that really gives you a sense of like, oh, yeah, you had to walk. At the same time, it's political to some degree, right? These black sharecroppers living sort of farther away from town are in a very different position from some of the wealthier white people living closer to town who may have cars as well and such. Like I said, the kid gets passed by a car on the way to school. He's late to school. And when he shows up there, it's a little bit out of place. Now, school, big part of this film, but this is another place where you can see that the movie is not heavy-handed, right? You might expect, this kid walks into this sort of school that's like, mostly white kids, but there's a couple black kids who are attending. And they talk a little bit later on about how he got that opportunity. But you might expect there to be some big dramatic event here or something where he's like really explicitly bullied by the students, or the teacher's like not nice to him or something like that, or there's some very overt racist thing that happens at the school. But there isn't. Instead, when he walks in, you just get this overwhelming feeling of, I don't know, feeling that he's out of place and unwelcome to some degree, or feeling that he's not content, that he's not comfortable in the surroundings at the very least. The teacher is somewhat civil to him. She doesn't really approve of him being late, but, also she seems to understand the situation, seems to understand why he is chronically late and such. The other students aren't, for a movie that's, a movie in 1972 about black sharecroppers, the characters in the plot are a lot more subtle than you might expect. There are a couple of big dramatic moments in this movie, but they're remarkably matter of fact. And this is a deeply emotional film, but it's also a restrained film in some ways. And that's not just part of the style, that's part of the content as well. That idea of restrained emotion or something, that idea of carrying on, one of the big themes of the movie. Like I said, there's the teacher's kind of interesting, sort of subtle character. There's a number of characters in the film, some white, some black, that are interesting, pretty subtle. The family, of course, is great. The younger siblings are a little bit non-existent in this movie. They're not the main focus. They're a little underdeveloped, but it's okay. Some people in the town, whether or not that's the sheriff or if it's one of a woman that the family does some of the washing for. Some of these characters drift in and out of the movie to some degree. There's some plot lines that spawn with some of them and then sort of fade away. But this is not a thriller where the plot determines everything, right? Where one, clue leads to the next clue, leads to the next clue, leads to the next clue, and everything sort of centers around that. The timing centers around that and such. This is a movie where the pages on the calendar keep turning. Time keeps going, the seasons change, and the stories come and go. Certain things happen here and there. Certain characters enter and then leave again, and it's kind of more about the vibe and the theme more than anything, and less about, some big twist or something like that. So like I said, this movie is in a lot of ways, more subtle than what you might expect for a movie about black sharecroppers. It's not an in-your-face political movie in some ways. And that might disappoint some people, honestly. I don't know. I think some people who go to see this movie today might expect it, especially if they've read a lot of reviews saying, wow, this is ahead of its time, this is a revolutionary film or something. They might expect it to be less subtle. They might expect the characters to be more militant or something like that, to be more overtly political. But that's not really the vibe of the movie. There's an interesting concept, I think, that I've sort of think about sometimes about like rational dramatic agents, essentially, where this is in a movie that's like a thriller or a spy film or something, like a James Bond film. A rational dramatic agent is going to be a character that will sort of intuitively proceed along the path that is optimizing most for audience satisfaction. You know what I mean? Like, there's a decision to be made. The character maybe will struggle with the decision, but let me rephrase that. Let's say that there's a big problem. There's some sort of big conflict in the story, and then a door opens up and the conflict is resolved. Well, the rational dramatic agent is going to go straight through that door and resolve the conflict, and everything's going to be okay, and the audience will breathe a sigh of relief, and it'll be great. This might be way too vague to make any sense, but hopefully it makes some sense, right? Like I said, spy films, this is how it goes. It's like the opportunity presents itself and it's taken or whatever. This movie, along with a lot of other more sort of realistic social realism films, psychological realism, realistic films in general, don't necessarily have these rational dramatic agents where they go straight to or where when the solution is sort of starts to present itself, they find their way directly to it. Instead, they struggle to some degree. They have conflicting interests, and maybe one solution presents itself. Maybe there's one thing that might sort of seem like a happy ending, and will they proceed directly towards it? Potentially, or will they be uncertain? Will they be considering other things? Will they be motivated by other things? Will they have different incentives? Well, this movie is a little bit more on that line, where these feel more like real characters who might not always do exactly what you would want them to. Okay, how did we come to this? Well, like I said, it's not an overtly political movie. It's not a militant movie. So this sort of logic can also come to play in terms of what characters say sometimes, right? An audience might want the film to be more overtly political or something. They might also want a character to be more overtly political, and sometimes they aren't. That said, this is a political movie. Politics are inseparable from the content of the film, obviously. But there also are some more subtle things or whatever, like I said, walking to school, being passed by this car, right? That's political. And education, right? And the through lines of education in this film are inherently political. So, like I said, you might not get exactly what you expect if you read a bunch of reviews saying revolutionary movie. But that should not dissuade you. This is a great movie. So to close, this movie's called Sounder, which is the name of the dog in the movies. The movie's named after the dog. And when you watch this, it seems fairly clear that Sounder is sort of a spiritual stand-in in some ways for some of the characters. A haggard dog who suffers various sort of setbacks, and such. I'm really not a dog person, and fortunately don't have to be to enjoy this movie. But a character with setbacks, and not with some sort of trite plot line about overcoming them, but with persistence, And I think precarity and persistence are sort of two of the big themes from this. And when I try and say this, it's going to seem really trite and obvious. But trust me, the movie's a lot more subtle and a lot more interesting than this. Essentially, these are characters with no safety net, right? Precarity. What will happen if if something goes wrong, how will we cope with that? Can we? This is a fundamental piece, precarity, a fundamental piece of poor, overlooked living. For middle-class people, maybe their closest brush with precarity is worrying about crashing a rental car or something like that. Some place where there's no plan B. For other people, that's their entire life. There's no plan B. There's no backup. There's no, what would you do if something goes wrong? At the same time, there's persistence. You know what I mean? And like I said, this is going to sound kind of trite. But kind of like the dog, the haggard dog Sounder, they carry on. That's kind of all you can do to some degree. And that, I think, those are kind of the big themes. But like I said, the movie, it's a delicate touch. It actually, it does justice to that. It's not some like Hallmark thing about like, oh, well, there's setbacks and you just keep going or whatever. Or if you have persistence, then all these political things aren't a problem. You can just overcome it or something. That's absolutely not what the movie says. But clearly these are themes of them, sort of embodied by the dog, Sounder. So like I said, overall, Sounder, I think, really solid movie. A sophisticated movie. A movie of a high order. Simple in some ways, but with an immense amount of depth, political, personal, and otherwise. So I would definitely recommend this movie, but like I said, I think you get the idea here. Like I said, this is a simple movie, so don't, you should know what to expect to some degree. But if you do, I think you could really enjoy this film, Sounder, because it is a phenomenal movie.